You will be shocked when you learn what people in the Wild West ate to survive the winter. For settler families, icy winds and snowstorms meant not adventure, but long months of isolation and a real battle for survival. In this battle, food became the main weapon, or more precisely, the ability to obtain, preserve, and prepare it. The pioneer's kitchen was a survival laboratory where every product was worth its weight in gold, and ingenuity was more important than any recipe. Forget about the foods we are used to. Their diet was dictated by desperation and necessity. Watch the video to the end, and you'll find out why a regular barrel of sand was more valuable than any chest, and which product, which we consider a dessert, was actually a strategic calorie reserve for the whole family. I will reveal the best-kept secret of survival on the frontier, and it is not weapons. The basis of the entire winter diet was not food, but what allowed it to be preserved: salt. Without it, any meat prey would spoil in a matter of days, condemning the family to starvation. Salt was not just a seasoning, but a strategic resource, a veritable white gold. Its cost was incredibly high, and delivery to remote areas of the frontier was a difficult and expensive undertaking. Some families spent a significant portion of their annual income on salt. Salt was extracted in various ways. Some people evaporated it from salt springs, while others embarked on long and dangerous expeditions to salt deposits. The availability of a reliable source of salt determined whether a family would survive the winter. The salting process was the main ritual of autumn. Every animal hunted was carefully cut up. The meat was rubbed with salt and placed in wooden barrels, where it was stored for months. The salt drew moisture out of the meat, creating an environment in which bacteria could not multiply. It was a simple and reliable method of preservation, known to mankind since ancient times, but for the pioneers, it was vital. In addition to meat, fish was also salted if there was a body of water nearby. Salted fish was an excellent source of protein and added variety to the meager winter diet. Each catch was carefully processed and sent to the barrels. The salt supply was an indicator of a family's wealth and foresight. An empty salt shaker in the middle of winter was tantamount to disaster. It meant that any fresh supplies had to be eaten immediately, with no possibility of preserving them for later. The quality of the salt was also important. Unrefined salt could give food a bitter taste, but there was no choice. Any salt was better than no salt at all. That is why control over salt sources often became a cause of conflict. Whoever controlled the salt essentially controlled life in the region. It was a resource that was valued more than gold. The entire food security system of the pioneers was built on this simple white crystal. It determined whether the table would be full or empty during the long, dark winter months. I wonder how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world. Where are you from? And what product is the main preservative in your culture? Are you ready to learn the truth about the main dish of the Wild West? When we talk about frontier food, meat is the first thing that comes to mind. Huge herds of bison and other game were the main source of protein, but fresh meat was a luxury available only immediately after a successful hunt. To survive the winter, meat had to be preserved, and two main methods came to the rescue: salting and drying. Salted meat was the basis of the diet. The meat was cut into large pieces, thickly sprinkled with salt, and tightly packed into barrels. After a while, the meat released juice, forming a concentrated brine that completely covered the pieces. In this form, it could be stored for months or even years. Before consumption, such a product had to be soaked in water for a long time to get rid of excess salt. Drying was another popular method, especially in drier regions. The meat was cut into thin, long strips and hung on wooden frames in the open air. The sun and wind slowly dried it, turning it into a hard, almost non-perishable product. This dried meat, known as jerky, was the perfect food for hunters and travelers. It was light, nutritious, and did not require special storage conditions. A piece of jerky could serve as lunch on a long journey. Often both methods were combined. The meat was first briefly soaked in brine and then dried. This gave the product additional protection against spoilage and improved its taste. To protect it from insects during drying, the meat was sometimes smoked. The smoke repelled pests and gave the meat a distinctive aroma. A small smokehouse was an important part of any farm yard. The taste of such products was far from what we are used to. Salted meat was very tough and salty, and jerky had to be chewed for a long time, soaked in water. But in terms of survival, it was not gastronomy, but a source of necessary calories. Salted meat was used to make thick soups and stews, adding root vegetables and grains. This made the meat softer and fed a large family. One piece of salted meat could be the basis for a whole pot of food. But what if I told you that even in the most well-fed homes, fat and trimmings were never thrown away? They were used to make a secret frontier superfood that was food, fuel, and even currency. Ready to find out what it was? What I'm about to show you is something the government doesn't want you to know because it will change your perception of calories. After cutting up the carcass, a huge amount of fat remained, which was one of the most valuable resources on the frontier. Throwing it away was unthinkable waste, so every housewife mastered the art of processing it or rendering. The process was simple but required attention. The fat was finely chopped and slowly melted over low heat in a large pot. It was important not to let it burn, otherwise the final product would have an unpleasant taste. The result was two fractions. Pure rendered fat, beef fat was called tallow, pork fat was called lard, and crispy cracklings. Both products were strategically important. Cracklings were a high-calorie snack, added to bread and other dishes. Rendered fat was poured into clay pots or barrels where it solidified and could be stored all winter without refrigeration. It was the main cooking fat used for frying and stewing. Vegetable oil was a rare and expensive luxury, but its functions were not limited to cooking. Tallow was the basis for making candles. It was poured into molds with wicks to produce a source of light, so necessary during the long winter evenings. The fat was also a key ingredient in soap making. It was mixed with wood ash and water to make lye, and then boiled for a long time until it became a thick mass. Homemade soap was rough, but absolutely essential for maintaining basic hygiene. In the hardest times, when other food ran out, lard itself became food. It could simply be spread on bread to make an incredibly filling and high-calorie sandwich. It was an energy bomb that allowed people to perform hard physical work in the cold. Fat was used to lubricate leather shoes and harnesses to make them waterproof and durable. It was used as a base for medicinal ointments mixed with herbs. It was truly a universal substance. A supply of fat was as important as a supply of salt or firewood. It provided light, heat, cleanliness, and food for the family. The ability to properly render and preserve fat was one of the main survival skills. Thus, ordinary animal fat was transformed into dozens of essential products in the hands of a skilled housewife. It was the embodiment of the frontier philosophy. Nothing is wasted, everything can be used. It was a truly waste-free economy, dictated by harsh necessity. What if everything you've been taught about food storage is outdated? Summer and fall were not only a time for preserving meat, but also for harvesting crops. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, rutabagas, and parsnips were the staple vegetables, and the main task was to preserve them until spring. To do this, pioneers built root cellars. These were specially dug rooms in the ground, often under or next to the house. The depth and thick layer of earth above the ceiling ensured a constant low temperature and high humidity throughout the year. The design of such a cellar was simple but effective. The walls were lined with stones or logs, and a ventilation hole was made at the top for air circulation. Inside, shelves and boxes for storing vegetables were placed along the walls. Potatoes and other root vegetables were usually stored in boxes, sprinkled with dry sand or soil. This helped prevent them from drying out or sprouting and protected them from rodents. A barrel with sand and potatoes was a common feature of any cellar. In addition to root vegetables, other vegetables such as cabbage were also stored in the cellar. The heads were hung from the ceiling by their stalks, and in this form they could be kept fresh for several months. Pumpkins and squash with hard skins also kept well in the cool cellar. The cellar was a real treasure trove for the family. Every trip down there in winter was like going to the store. It was there that the ingredients for thick and hearty winter soups, which formed the basis of the daily menu, were taken from. Proper storage of the harvest was essential for survival. Even the richest harvest could be destroyed by frost or rot if it was not stored properly. Therefore, the construction of a reliable cellar was given top priority. In winter, the entrance to the cellar was often blocked by snow and had to be dug out. But these efforts were nothing compared to the value stored in its cool, dark depths. It was a strategic reserve of vitamins and carbohydrates. Over time, root cellars became an integral part of any farmhouse. They were built even before the main living quarters were finished. Without a cellar, a house was not considered completely ready for life on the frontier. Root vegetables were accessible, nutritious, and stored well. They were the perfect food for harsh conditions. But what did they do with the gifts of summer that couldn't simply be stored in the cellar? In the next chapter, you'll learn about the tricks of preserving food in a world without glass jars and refrigerators. Summer on the frontier was short but generous with its harvest of vegetables, fruits, and berries. Preserving this abundance for the winter was a top priority. In the absence of modern preservation methods, housewives resorted to recipes that had been tried and tested for centuries. One of the main methods was salting and pickling. Cucumbers, cabbage, green tomatoes, and even watermelons were placed in wooden barrels, covered with brine, and left to ferment. Sauerkraut was not only delicious but also an extremely healthy product, rich in vitamin C which protected against scurvy. Drying was another reliable way to preserve the harvest. Apples, apricots, and peaches were cut into thin slices and laid out in the sun or dried in a cooling oven. In winter, dried fruits were used to make compotes and kissels, which reminded people of the taste of summer. Berries were used to make what is known as fruit leather. The berries were boiled down to a thick puree, poured in a thin layer onto boards, and dried in the sun. The result was sweet and nutritious sheets that were a favorite treat. Mushrooms were also dried by stringing them on threads and hanging them in a dry, ventilated place. In winter, dried mushrooms were added to soups and stews, giving them a rich flavor and aroma. They were a valuable source of vegetable protein. Surplus fruits and berries were used to make jams, preserves, and jellies. Sugar was expensive, so it was used sparingly, often replaced with honey or maple syrup. Fruit boiled with sugar could be stored for a very long time in tightly closed clay pots. Vinegar was also an important preservative. Not only vegetables, but also some types of fruit were pickled in it. Pickled peaches or plums were a spicy appetizer that graced the winter table. The preparation process took up all the free time at the end of summer and beginning of autumn. The whole family was involved in gathering, cleaning, cutting, and preserving the harvest. The variety of the winter menu depended on how well this work was coordinated. Each jar of pickles, each bag of dried fruit was a small victory over future hunger. The pantry, filled with summer preserves, gave a sense of confidence and security. It was a guarantee that the family would be able to survive the harshest frosts. These simple methods allowed them to preserve not only calories, but also vitamins, which were so necessary for maintaining health. It was the true wisdom of generations, embodied in barrels of sauerkraut and bundles of dried mushrooms. Ready to find out which product was the real king of the table in the Wild West? It was corn. Unpretentious, high-yielding, and versatile, it was the basis of the carbohydrate diet for many immigrant families. Corn was grown everywhere. After harvesting, the cobs were dried and stored in barns, protected from moisture and rodents. Dry grain could be stored for years without losing its properties. To obtain flour, the grains were ground by hand on small domestic millstones. This was hard daily work, which usually fell on the shoulders of women. Freshly ground corn flour was used to make the most popular dish, cornbread. Cornbread was baked in heavy cast iron pans directly over an open fire or in an oven. It was dense, filling, and could replace both bread and a side dish. A piece of warm cornbread with butter or lard was a complete meal. Cornmeal was also used to make porridge, known as grits or mamaliga. It was a simple and inexpensive food that was often served for breakfast. It was eaten with milk, butter, or meat gravy. Wheat was less common because it was more demanding to grow. But those who had wheat flour baked sourdough bread. The sourdough starter was carefully stored, fed, and passed down from generation to generation. When there was no time or opportunity to bake proper bread, simple flatbread or galettes were made. Dough made from flour, water, and salt was fried in a pan or baked directly on hot stones. These galettes, or hardtack, were the staple food on long journeys. Grains were not just food, they were a symbol of stability. A full sack of flour in the corner meant that the family would not go hungry, even if the hunt was unsuccessful. Bread was at the center of the table and at the center of life. Often flour had to be economized. Ground acorns, nuts, or even dried root vegetables were mixed in to increase the volume. The taste of such bread was peculiar, but it provided the necessary calories. Do you think modern people could survive the winter on such a diet? But even the most filling bread needed to be supplemented. In the next chapter, we will talk about how the wild helped diversify the pioneers' diet. Autumn on the frontier was not only a time for harvesting the fields, but also a time for quiet hunting. The forests and prairies offered their gifts to those who were observant and hardworking enough. Gathering was an important aid to survival. Nuts were one of the main treasures of the forest. Walnuts, pecans, hickory nuts, all were gathered in large quantities. Nuts were rich in protein and fat, could be stored for a long time, and were an excellent addition to the winter diet. They were eaten plain, added to baked goods, or ground into a nutritious paste. Nut oil was sometimes used in cooking. Every bag of nuts was a contribution to winter food security. Wild berries, cranberries, blueberries, raspberries were gathered throughout the summer. They were dried, made into jam, or used to make the aforementioned fruit leather. Dried cranberries, for example, could be stored all winter and were an excellent source of vitamins. Edible roots and wild plants were also used for food. People learned from Native Americans which plants were edible and which were poisonous. Wild chicory roots, for example, were dried and used as a coffee substitute. Even acorns became edible after special treatment. They were soaked in several waters to remove the bitter tannins, then dried and ground into flour. This flour was mixed with corn or wheat flour to bake bread. Maple syrup was another valuable gift of nature. In early spring, when other supplies were running low, the collection of maple sap began. It was boiled down to a sweet syrup, which was the main sweetener on many farms. Wild honey was also highly prized. Finding a hollow tree with honey was a great stroke of luck. Honey was not only a delicacy, but also a medicine, used for colds and to treat wounds. Gathering required a deep knowledge of the surrounding nature. It was necessary to know when and where to look for certain plants, how to collect and process them correctly. This knowledge was passed down from parents to children and was as important as the ability to shoot or farm. Every basket of mushrooms, every jug of berries, every bag of nuts was a small contribution to the great cause of survival. Nature generously shared its riches with those who knew how to take and appreciate them. Having a cow on a frontier farm was a sign of a certain level of prosperity and stability. A cow provided milk, a valuable source of protein and fat. However, ensuring its survival during the harsh winter was a separate and difficult task. The main problem was feed. A huge amount of hay had to be harvested for the winter. All summer long, the men mowed the grass in the meadows, then dried it and stacked it in haystacks. The life of the cow, and accordingly, the well-being of the family depended directly on the size of the haystack. A lack of feed in winter could lead to the loss of the animal. Therefore, haymaking was one of the most important summer tasks. In winter, cows were kept in a barn or a primitive shelter to protect them from wind and frost. Caring for animals during the cold season required daily effort. They had to be fed, watered, and cleaned. Fresh milk was a real delicacy in winter. It was drunk and used to cook porridge. It was especially important for maintaining strength. However, most of the milk was processed into long-life products. One such product was butter. The milk was left to settle, the cream was skimmed off, and then churned in a butter churn until butter was obtained. The process of churning butter was long and monotonous work. The resulting butter was washed in cold water and salted for better storage. A barrel of salted butter in the cellar was another guarantee of a well-fed winter. The buttermilk left over after churning was used in baking or simply drunk. It was a healthy and refreshing drink. Nothing went to waste. Cheese was also made from milk. The cheese-making process was more complicated than butter making and required certain skills. However, a head of hard cheese could be stored for a very long time, becoming only tastier with time. Thus, one cow provided a family with a whole range of essential products. It turned summer grass into milk, butter, and cheese, which helped them survive the long winter months. Despite all the summer preparations, fresh protein was still needed in winter. Therefore, hunting did not stop even in the most severe frosts. It was not entertainment, but a vital task. In winter, people hunted deer, rabbits, and other small game that did not hibernate. It was easier to track animals in the snow, but hunting itself was very difficult. Frost, deep snow, and cold winds made every trip to the forest a real challenge. Hunters had to be not only accurate, but also extremely resilient and knowledgeable about the terrain. They often had to leave for several days, spending the night in makeshift shelters. A successful return with prey was a real celebration for the whole family. In addition to firearms, traps, and snares were widely used. They were set on animal trails, which allowed hunters to obtain game without wasting precious ammunition. Checking the traps was part of the daily routine. Frozen meat could be stored outside throughout the winter. The carcass was cut up and hung in a barn or other cold room. It was a natural refrigerator. Fishing was also an important source of food if there were unfrozen rivers or large lakes nearby. Ice fishing required patience and skill. A hole in the ice was a window into the underwater world, which could provide a hearty dinner. Fish were caught with primitive tackle, often handmade. Hooks could be carved from bone or hard wood. Anything that could be found was used as bait. The fish they caught was a welcome addition to their meat-based diet. It was boiled, fried, or smoked. Fish soup made from freshly caught fish was the best way to warm up after a long day in the cold. Hunting and fishing were a direct link to the wild. They required respect for the surrounding world and a deep understanding of its laws. Survival depended directly on these skills. It was these fresh foods, obtained through risk and hard work, that helped to replenish vitamin deficiencies and maintain health. They were a reminder that even in the harshest of environments, a source of life can always be found. In a freezing house where the only source of heat was the hearth, hot drinks were not a luxury, but a necessity. They not only warmed the body, but also lifted the spirits. The drinking culture on the frontier was simple and pragmatic. The main drink was coffee. However, real coffee beans were expensive and not always available. Therefore, it was often stretched by adding various additives. The most popular substitute was roasted chicory root. It was dug up, dried, roasted, and ground. Chicory drink had a similar color and bitter taste, but did not contain caffeine. Roasted barley, rye, or even dried carrots were also used as additives. A mixture of a small amount of real coffee and these substitutes was the most common morning drink. It was drunk black and very hot. Tea was less popular and was considered more of a medicine. Not only store-bought tea was used, but also various herbal teas. Tea made from mint, chamomile, or raspberry leaves was drunk for colds and to calm the nerves. Milk, as already mentioned, was a valuable product. It was drunk both cold and warm, often with a little honey or molasses added. A glass of warm milk before bed was the best remedy for insomnia. Alcoholic beverages also played a role. Farmers often made cider from their own apples. In the fall, the apples were pressed, the juice was fermented, and by winter, a low-alcohol, refreshing drink was ready. In regions where corn grew, it was used to make whiskey. Homemade moonshine, or moonshine, was strong and sharp. It was used not only for entertainment, but also as a warming and disinfecting agent. Of course, Alcohol abuse was a major social problem, but in moderation, these drinks were part of the culture and way of life. They helped people relax after a hard day and warm up in cold weather. Thus, even in such a simple matter as beverages, the ingenuity of the pioneers was evident. They used whatever was at hand to create the illusion of comfort and coziness in a harsh and unforgiving world. We looked into the pantries and cellars of the pioneers of the Wild West and saw that their survival in winter was a real art. It was a carefully planned operation where every product and every method of preparation was of strategic importance. Salted meat, sauerkraut, rendered fat, and cornbread were not just food. They were the building blocks of life. This story is not about delicacies, but about incredible human resilience and ingenuity. It shows how, in conditions of constant struggle, people learn to take everything from nature, turning the simplest things into a guarantee of their future. Their experience is a harsh but important reminder of what it means to truly appreciate food. Which of the pioneers' survival strategies did you find most surprising? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the past.